Well, I'm delighted to participate. We're at a moment in time when the issue of cyber threats is very much top of mind because of what's going on in the world, and geopolitical risk and geopolitical conflict occur in cyberspace as well as in real space. And there are equally significant and potentially problematic consequences. Let me begin briefly by just reminding everybody what the evolution of cyber risk has been over the last 20 or 30 years. At the point at which the internet became commercial and open to the general public, as opposed to merely being an internal communications process for the security people, the Defense Department, and academia, at that point we started to see that criminals began to gravitate to the internet as a way in which they could enrich themselves. It began with the theft of money and the theft of identity used in order, for example, to commit financial frauds. We quickly moved to the issue of espionage, where nation states would use access to the internet to steal national secrets. But maybe even more troubling, it became a vehicle for commercial enterprise and intellectual property theft. And one of the things we saw, for example, with China, was the use of cyber tools as a way of stealing a great deal of technical information, which could then be repurposed to help Chinese enterprises compete with Western enterprises in a variety of respects. But maybe even more troubling in more recent times, we've begun to see her as a vehicle for destructive behavior in the real world. As we have moved more and more of our industrial control systems online and more of our business processes online, it becomes possible for criminal groups and even nation state adversaries to use the internet as a way of actually damaging or disrupting, for example, the power grid, water supplies, communications, and a whole host of other things, including in particular financial transactions. And what that's meant is that we now have to be concerned not only about the theft of money, but about consequences in the real world that could cause loss of life and a tremendous amount of property damage simply by using the internet as a vehicle for entering and then manipulating control systems to disrupt or destroy that infrastructure. You know, one example of that, which I know you just heard, was ransomware, which was originally used to freeze access to data that would make it impossible for businesses to operate because they wouldn't have access to their data. And yet, the original plan was to demand money as a way of unlocking the encryption that froze the data. But more recently, nation states have begun to use ransomware where there is no ransom. It's just freezing the data and basically throwing away the key to decrypting what has now been frozen out. And of course, a classic example of that, many of you will know, was NotPetya, where a few years ago, Russian agents operated to attack a software program for accounting purposes in Kyiv, in Ukraine. And the consequence was to basically freeze the business processes of many enterprises that had offices in Ukraine and that had downloaded that accounting software. Among the enterprises that were actually damaged were non-Ukrainian enterprises. For example, Maersk, the shipping company, and Merck, the pharmaceutical company, which are respectively European and American in terms of where they're based. They also lost access to some of their financial data because they happened to have offices in Ukraine. So we now have to view the possibility of the use of cyber tools as a way of literally disrupting the ordinary business processes and even life-supporting infrastructure when there is an international conflict. I should also observe that it's often the case that criminals engage in the use of ransomware, but it may be with the behest of, or at least the toleration of, nation states that see an advantage in, again, damaging the activities of their adversaries. The last and most recent area where we've seen developments in terms of cyber threats, and the one that I think is most maybe relevant to the discussion here, is information warfare. It's been understood for a long time that if you can disrupt the unity of effort of your geopolitical opponent, you can actually win a conflict. I can go back 100 years to when there was a Soviet Union, and the Soviets used to try to use propaganda to disrupt or distract Western democracies because they felt that that weakened them. And it worked to some extent. But what's happened now is with cyber tools, the ability to carry out information warfare has much amplified. The scale of it has increased. The effectiveness of it's increased. And we are seeing that more and more as we enter an era where, for example, we see Russia invading Ukraine and we see geopolitical conflict between the West and autocracies. So having laid out kind of how we've progressed to where we are now, let me talk about who, from a Western standpoint and a NATO and a EU standpoint, who we have to view as maybe the most significant adversaries about whom we have to worry from the standpoint of cybersecurity. Top of mind is Russia. As I said, obviously, we have seen Russian use of ransomware to damage not just Ukraine, but even countries doing business in Ukraine. And going back earlier than that, we saw the Russians attack Ukraine power grid and shut it down for periods of time, again, as a way of weakening and damaging Ukraine. And so cyber tools and cyber weapons are a key part of what is currently going on with the aggression that the Russians are engaged in against Ukraine. But we also have to view as adversaries, although perhaps not in quite as dramatic a way, China and Iran. The Chinese have been using cyber tools for a considerable amount of time to steal information, but now they've actually built an artificial intelligence capability that allows them to use that information to manipulate their geopolitical rivals. And you would have to say that China views the West, Europe, and the United States as a geopolitical rival and vice versa. The Iranians use cyber tools. They're not quite as sophisticated as the Russians and Chinese, but they are reasonably sophisticated. They've attacked, for example, US banks years ago in retaliation because of economic sanctions. As we have the war going on now in Gaza, we may well see the Iranians engaged in cyber attacks, although I think they've also been warned that if they commit cyber aggression against other countries, they may find a response that will be more devastating to them. I should also finally observe that while nation states sometimes directly engage in cyber warfare, often they use cutouts. They use criminal groups that they will essentially purpose to carry out a cyber attack, but that creates a certain element of deniability. And so one of the challenges in dealing with these issues is to attribute a cyber attack to a nation state when they are actually the motivating force behind what has been engaged in by what is nominally an independently acting criminal group. Now, as we talk about information warfare, there are some particular tools that we see being used increasingly, and I think are what I want to talk about for the rest of my keynote. And those have to do with disinformation and social engineering using artificial intelligence. So disinformation at one level is simply lying about things, maybe blaming one country, blaming another falsely for committing war crimes or aggression. But what's made this particularly effective for some actors is the ability to use social engineering and algorithms with artificial intelligence to very specifically target individuals in the other country with information that is calculated to really appeal to some internal bias or prejudice and essentially pull their chain and get them to be very, very alert, because this touches a very sore spot in their own experience and in their own views. So essentially what's happened is we've got very tailor-made information attacks that contain falsehoods that are carefully devised and calculated to be of particular appeal to the target audience, even at the individual level. And often the way that's done is by obtaining huge amounts of personal data about what individuals search for on the internet, watch as entertainment, buy, with their income, or even who their relations are and what political news they tend to consume most. And that data, when it is collected and applied to artificial intelligence, allows for a very carefully crafted message that is specifically designed to avoid the normal skepticism that that kind of messaging might face, and therefore appeal to someone where they're most vulnerable. One dimension of this is when a message is sent to somebody by a source that appears to be a friend or a relative, but is really not. It's merely artificial intelligence simulating or pretending to be a friend or relative in a way that fools the recipient and therefore misleads the recipient into believing something that in fact is fabricated. So that's really what the landscape now is with respect to cyber threats. And I might say, as it comes to the issue of information warfare, we have seen elections as being a very significant battleground in which adversaries of democracy and advocates of autocracy use information warfare as a way to either affect elections in other countries or discredit the whole process of democracy, which they view as useful in undermining the ability of their geopolitical rivals to, again, achieve a unity of effort in terms of fighting back. We saw that, for example, in the election in the United States in 2016, when a particular firm called Cambridge Analytica used data that had been collected on a personal level and artificial intelligence and enabled micro-targeting by adversaries of particular voters and voting blocks in a way that was designed to be very effective in misleading them. We also saw the Russians, for example, penetrate the Democratic National Committee and steal information and documents, which were then disseminated in a way, again, to try to discredit the campaign of Hillary Clinton and thereby assist the campaign of Donald Trump. So we have seen this in the United States, and I think we're certainly very, very alert to the possibility we're going to see it again. I understand Slovakia had an election this year, and again, there was a discussion of what are sometimes called deep fakes, simulated audio or video messages that appear to be from a candidate or from some individual who's a notable individual, but are really completely fabricated by artificial intelligence, which is able to mimic the appearance and the voice of somebody in a way that is largely undetectable by the average person. So this issue is continuing to become a very front and center issue with respect to protecting our democracies. So let me lay out a little bit of what I see as the specific threats to democracy we need to focus on and how we need to respond to those as we come to the upcoming elections, both in the US and within the European Union. First of all, again, as I mentioned, the traditional theft of information from your political adversary and disseminating it in a way that's misleading. We saw that previously in 2016 with the Democratic National Committee. I'm sure we're going to see efforts to do that again. And the solution to dealing with that is to make sure that you are raising your level of cybersecurity to prevent the penetration of your network and the theft of data or intellectual property about your campaign. That means you have to have multiple layers of defense, not just the endpoint, but you need to have access controls that are based on identity verification, including what they call multi-factor authentication, where you're using not just the password, but even something physical about your appearance or some additional code or even a device that verifies that you are entitled to get access to a particular part of the network. Those kinds of more sophisticated cybersecurity tools will be very important, not only for campaigns, but for the government agencies that are operating the election infrastructure. Because one of the real concerns is a foreign adversary enters your voter registration process and locks it down with ransomware, or otherwise distorts the ability to manage the election process. And if that happens, people who turn up to vote might discover all of a sudden that they are not allowed to vote because there is no clear record that they are registered to vote or that they are otherwise qualified to vote. So in addition to defending the network against those efforts to disrupt the actual voting process, you need to make sure that the election agencies have a backup for their critical records so that even if someone is able to penetrate the network, notwithstanding security, and lock down the data about who is entitled to vote, that you have an independent database, maybe in the cloud, that you can then turn to in order to allow the voting process to go forward. I might observe that a great lesson in this actually was, again, something we can see in Ukraine, because when they were attacked in February of 2022 by the Russians, there were attacks on their networks, their cyber and government networks, but they had wisely previously moved their data into a backup on the cloud, which was outside of Ukraine. And that meant that even if their primary network was inaccessible, they had the necessary data to govern in the backup in the cloud. And so that's something that election agencies should be thinking about. Another area I think we need to be very focused on, again, in the area of disinformation, as I said earlier, is the use of algorithms based on data that is collected from a wide variety of sources to attempt to mislead people either into voting against the candidate or into simply distrusting the whole system, so that they wind up believing that elections are not fair because you can't trust them, and therefore that really undermines democracy. And there are three areas, I think, in particular, where we ought to be on guard for disinformation. One, as I said earlier, is impersonation, where somebody reaches out to you and pretends to be your relative or your close friend, and they tell you that you ought to vote for or against the candidate, and because you trust them, it affects you. The problem is it's not really that. It's really a deep fake voice or a deep fake video, if you're doing a video conference, that really looks like your friend or your relative, but isn't, is really an artificial intelligence construct. Here we need to look in particular at the platforms themselves, the various social media platforms, to make sure they validate the identity of people when they represent themselves to have an identity. And even we can look to some of the platforms to use artificial intelligence to probe whether someone who identifies themselves in a particular way is genuine, or whether something about the way they're either behaving or the course in which their posting has occurred suggests that they are actually artificial. So I do think we need to be mindful of impersonation. Second, we need to worry about algorithms that allow manipulative targeting, again, based upon data that has been taken from individuals that can now be used to determine what are their hot button concerns that you can kind of inflame, and that gets them to become agitated perhaps and to reverse a prior support for a candidate, or simply decide they don't want to vote because they don't believe in the process. And here again, I think the platforms have a responsibility to limit the way algorithms are used and to validate whether the algorithms are used for a legitimate purpose. it also means that to the extent algorithms are built using data from individuals that is collected, people who have custody and control of that data need to make sure it is not being taken or misused for a purpose without consent of the person whose data it is. So having a consent requirement for the use of data, which I think is part of the European GDPR, General Data Protection Regulation, again, is also a very useful defense against election disinformation. And finally, when we deal in particular with what I've described as deep fakes or deep voice fakes, we need to be able to give people a tool that they can use to discern whether, in fact, a video or audio is real or whether it is manufactured artificially. One way is what we call watermarking, where you have as an element in your online tool, anytime you have a video or an audio that you create, that you watermark it in an encrypted way so that nobody, A, can alter it, and B, so that the person who receives it knows that you actually created it and it is actually the person who is speaking is the real person. If you don't get watermarked, then you run the risk of not being able to tell whether a video or audio is fake or not. I think there is also an effort being made to use artificial intelligence again to sometimes detect subtle anomalies in videos and audios that might also give warning about a deep fake. And again, I think we have to encourage the platforms to take whatever steps they can so that if something is a fake, they label it and the public knows that this is not a real video or audio, it is merely a manufactured or simulated video or audio. I also think we should frankly have rules with our election government regulators that a campaign, if it is going to use some simulation of a video or audio, has an obligation to clearly label and disclose this is not real, this is only a simulation. So I think there's a lot to be done in this area. And I would conclude by saying that we really mostly need to educate the public. I think the biggest danger to democracy are efforts on the part of autocrats to discredit it and to say you can't trust democracy, you can't trust elections, and therefore you trust the dictator or the strong man. And unfortunately, there's a wave of that kind of argumentation going around the world, and it's being aided and abetted by some of our big autocratic rivals like Russia and China. So I think as much as we need to defend ourselves against physical danger, we also need to defend ourselves against intellectual danger. And with that, I'll be happy to turn it over to answer questions.
Thank you very much. Let me follow up on the elections. We consider free election in an old school way, right? We just consider the physical voting to be free. So can we talk about free election in case of all the threats you were talking about, all the misinformation, impersonation, artificial intelligence, and other threats you have mentioned? Are we still talking about free elections in the cyber online way?
I think we clearly have to work to protect our elections and keep them free. Now, I mean, to be, fair, since elections first started hundreds of years ago, there have always been people who lied or cheated, and it didn't mean elections aren't largely fair and accurate. But as we get more sophisticated methods by our adversaries, we need to be more sophisticated in defending our elections. So how do we do that? One thing is we label deep fakes and things that are not accurate, or we work to prevent people from impersonating relatives and friends. Part of it is in terms of databases, we build resilience. If you have a registration database and you're worried it's going to be shut down and therefore people will be denied the right to vote, you build a backup system. In fact, I know it sounds a little quaint, but sometimes your backup system that's most effective is something called paper. You make a paper record, and if the internet winds up being corrupted or goes down, you have paper as a way of validating who can vote. So I do think if we are strategic and we're disciplined, we can reduce the risk of anything that would really undermine an election. But part of it is, again, as I said, we need to educate the public about what is being done so they can be confident that their votes are being accurately counted and they're not being corrupted in some way.
You've mentioned Cambridge Analytica. So we can see the rise of AI that is likely to exacerbate disinformation, and we are witnessing its emergence in political campaigns in Slovakia as well, as you've mentioned before, but we can see using the tools in campaigns in Argentina, for example, in these elections that we just had. So is there, from a personal perspective, any way to protect against something like this?
Well, I think one area, particularly as you deal with deep fakes and deep videos, people are developing techniques to detect those. In the early days, it was pretty easy because you would have somebody on a video and, for example, the image wouldn't blink. And so it was obvious there was something funny about that. Obviously, the techniques have gotten better, but I would say that just as artificial intelligence can be used for nefarious purposes, it may also be able to be used to look and discredit deepfake videos. For example, you might have a video that appears to be a political figure saying things that are offensive, but the timing of when it supposedly occurred, how the person was dressed, the nature of the audience, you might be able to use AI to show that actually those things are not consistent with that person being there. And therefore, it raises a question about the video. You might even say that if the video doesn't have a watermark where the person being videoed validated that this is their image, that you should also be skeptical. So some of it will be educating the public. I think the social media platforms have an obligation to police this and label things that are obviously misleading or false. And so that, again, I know in Europe, they've got more regulations than in the US on this, but I do think these European regulations are going to be very helpful.
Yeah, well, let me follow up on that, because government often accuse social media platforms of not doing enough to combat the disinformation. Where does the line between platform responsibility and government intervention lie?
Well, I think, we always want to be a little careful about government intervention because we don't want to have government be too powerful and shut down legitimate speech. So we have to be fair about that. But I do think that what government can do is set some basic objectives and governing principles down. And then the platforms give them the discretion and flexibility to achieve those results in a way that is consistent with their technology and with their business, but recognize they need to be able to make progress towards those results. And again, those results are identifying the true identity of somebody who posts on social media, identifying when there is a deep fake audio or video, and also making sure that when people are using data to formulate these kinds of online efforts, that it's data that the original data possessor has consented to and is willing to allow to be used for purposes of this artificial intelligence. And those are basic principles of fairness, which I think have been used by regulators, for all kinds of reasons over the last 20 or 30 years.
Well, you've mentioned some of the countries that lead the misinformation field, right? Russia, China, Iran. Do democracies inherently draw the short end of the stick? Autocracies and dictatorships let countries simply play by completely different rules. So is it possible to, in the context of democracy and freedom, compete on an equal footing with states that are not bound by such constraints?
I mean, you raise a good point. I mean, obviously, if you're an autocracy, you can simply order things a certain way. and maybe it makes it easier than democracy, which requires more discussion and compromise and things like that. On the other hand, as we have a saying in the US, you don't want to burn the house down to save it. Creating an autocracy to try to prevent autocracy would be kind of a contradiction in terms. I think that with proper education, it is possible to preserve democratic values in a way that can be effective against autocrats who use their tools to try to mislead or undermine. And one thing I will say is this: when you have people who have faith in their government and democracy, their commitment to go the extra mile to protect their country and their values, I think in many ways exceeds what one sees in autocracies, where often people go to fight literally because they've got a gun to their back and they don't have a choice. And I think if you look at what's going on in Ukraine now, I think the enthusiasm of the Russians for what they're doing is a little questionable in my mind, given that so many of the military forces being deployed against Ukraine appear to be prisoners who are being offered a choice: stay in prison or go fight. So I'm a believer in democracy. It's a little messier than autocracy, but at the end of the day, it's more resilient. And I think you get a degree of commitment from citizens that most dictatorships can't command.
Some critics argue that governments use the rhetoric of cybersecurity to justify surveillance and encroach on citizens' privacy, right? Since I'm a journalist, I'm particularly concerned about this. But it's not even the government. You can talk about Apple fighting against pornography, and the company can see all of your images and pictures in your phone. So. How do you respond to concerns that the pursuit of cybersecurity might undermine the very democratic values it aims to protect, like journalists, activists, NGOs, dissent, and other people like this?
Well, I do think we need to be careful about that. And let me say, first of all, that in many ways where the collection and harvesting of huge amounts of data began is with commercial motivations. Basically, the platforms want to sell you things, because if you'll buy things, then the people who make them, the advertisers, are willing to pay the platforms. The business model is, we're going to monetize your data, your personal data. It'll be used to market to you. And the more successful marketing is, the more our advertising rates go up. And it is true that a lot of that data can then be repurposed and used in a way that invades privacy, or otherwise, undermines your freedom. And I actually wrote a book about this called Exploding Data, where I talked about the fact that most people don't know how much data they generate. They may think they do, but they miss a lot of what is actually being collected. And that if you don't have a way of giving people control over how that data is used, it could be used to undermine their freedom. And it could be used to coerce them into doing things because they're worried that almost everything that they do is being monitored and being held against them. It's a little bit like George Orwell's 1984, but taken like 10 times more effectively. So to me, again, I commend the Europeans, creating rules about how governments can't simply use data, but have to be restricted in how they use the data, I think is an important consideration. Sometimes there are compelling reasons to give access to data, but it ought to be on a more or less on a case-by-case basis, depending on how private the data is. And I think we also have to recognize that even the ability of the private sector to market data they collect needs to be restricted in a way that allows for use that is intrinsic to the service being provided, but doesn't allow marketing of data for other purposes without explicit consent. So, I think the whole issue of data, which has been described sometimes as the new gold, does need a careful and balanced analysis and review on a periodic basis to make sure that it is not undermining the very democracy we want to protect.
Let me talk about the election interference more. It is a persistent threat, and some argue that democratic nations are not doing enough to deter state-sponsored cyber attacks. So let's talk about more Slovakia. Probably we would think that the only country that has these kind of interests in Slovakia is Russia. So what concrete steps should be taken for Slovakia, for example, to hold nations like Russia accountable for meddling democratic processes?
Well, I mean, I think, as you kind of say, the key is to name and shame, to lay it out there, to, where there is an indication that Russia, for example, is engaged in disinformation. And often you can tell because, as in 2016, some of the social media postings come from a location in St. Petersburg, even though they're pretending to be from your neighbor down the street. That's pretty obvious, obviously not an accurate bit of information and being propagated by the Russians. So I think we need to share intelligence about what we know concerning these disinformation campaigns, and then it needs to be made public. And the public needs to understand that this is, for example, Russia that is carrying out this campaign, and that ought to frankly inoculate people against being persuaded. And I think we have had indications in the past where we did call out Russian interference, and that has, for at least people of good faith, had an impact on their assessment of the information.
Well, the Russian interference is always in favor of somebody, right? So what if the government that is supposed to fight this is using these very tools to retain the power?
Well, that's, I think, what we all are concerned about. And, again, I think in 2020, we had a candidate in the US who wanted to be reelected, who I think was someone favored by the Russians. But fortunately, the public was smart enough not to get misled. And again, the best sunlight is the truth. If you can detect this and put out the truth, and if you've educated people about the importance of the integrity of their vote and that their will ought to be respected, not manipulated, I think you can counteract some of what these foreign adversaries like the Russians are doing. But again, it's about education. It's about being scrupulous, not to overstate the case, but to be able to prove what you're saying. And again, I'm hoping that as we develop more tools in terms of artificial intelligence, it may be easier actually to identify flaws in the presentation by the adversary that the public can say, okay, now we understand this is not a real piece of information, it's something that's false.
You were talking about ransomware attacks. It have become increasingly sophisticated, and some argue that paying ransoms only fuels the industry, right? How do you propose breaking this cycle? Should there be legal consequences for organizations that pay ransom? What is the solution for this case?
Well, I agree. Paying ransom when a ransom is demanded only encourages more of this. And it's, by the way, by no means guaranteed these days that if you pay the ransom, they're going to release your data anyway. I understand that sometimes if it's really a matter of your business survival, you feel like you don't have much of a choice. I think one of the solutions, though, is to go back to the question of what I said earlier, which is resiliency, building a backup. And I mean, again, you look to Ukraine, they had years of being attacked by the Russians. On a couple of occasions, the Russians shut down the power grid for a period of time. There was the NotPetya, which was ransomware without the ransom. And the lesson that the Ukrainians learned is, while we can't stop all cyber attacks, we can't be perfect. If we have a backup, if we move the data to the cloud and we move it outside Ukraine and we have a commercial cloud enterprise, then we have the ability to reconstitute our capabilities, even if our primary network is taken down. And I think one of the lessons that's underappreciated sometimes in the area of cybersecurity is how important resilience or a backup plan is in order to make sure that your operations don't shut down. And, you know, one of the things I've done over recent years is work with enterprises to plan and train on how you build resilience and what would be the most effective way to recover if, in fact, an attack were successful, as you have to assume some of them will be.
The most vulnerable entities appear to be public institutions, hospitals, heating plants, power plants. It seems that, for example, Slovakia invests very little in this infrastructure and in cybersecurity, and the state struggles to afford the best IT professionals. Most of the institutions are underfunded, unlike the private sector. So is the state, the government, the most vulnerable in this regard?
I think everybody's vulnerable. You have attacks that succeed against government and, of course, the private sector, and everybody has to play a role. One of the things we've tried to do in the US in recent years is build more of a public-private partnership where you get the government agencies and the private sector together to work in common on a strategy and to assist each other in understanding what the threats are. And you know, the value of that is you have a kind of collective wisdom and you can help each other build better defenses. That's particularly important as you deal with smaller and medium enterprises that operate critical infrastructure. They may not have the ability themselves to build a defensive structure and to be mindful of what the threats are. But again, if they get help from larger enterprises and from government, that can help make up the difference. And, you know, having a collective approach to defense, to resilience, to recovery, to intelligence sharing, that reduces the cost to each individual enterprise, but it allows them all to benefit from the collective wisdom.
I understand, but the international collaboration sounds good in theory, but in practice, there are many obstacles, right? For example, we could see the shift of the United States of America while Trump was president away from the NATO alliance. And nations often have conflicting interests. So can we really rely on the international collaboration?
Well, I think by and large, it's been good. But I agree with you. It's something we need to constantly foster and promote and reinforce. I mean, NATO does have a center of excellence. NATO is a good vehicle for sharing information, but we could also use other international institutions, like, for example, the EU, or we have what we call the Five Eyes: the US, UK, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. And these, if we have a number of these cross-cutting international groups, I think the chances of somebody being able to reduce all of them becomes much less. The more of these interconnections we have, and I think particularly the big multinational enterprises can be helpful here, the more embedded we are in each other's security, and that makes it less likely that someone can totally pull themselves out. I'm not saying it's not possible, but I'm saying we ought to struggle against any effort to disconnect from our allies and other like-minded nations.
Well, let's hope for the best. Thank you for your time. Thank you very much. I can see that you have a morning in the US, so have a nice day. Michael Chertoff, former US Secretary of Homeland Security. Thank you for your keynote speech, for your answers, and for your time.
Thank you. My pleasure.